Robert Montgomery, a solitary millionaire, found himself yearning for something more than his vast empire of businesses and properties. Despite his wealth, a void gnawed at him, driving him to seek a new investment project. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about purpose. Early one crisp morning, he decided to embark on a road trip, an unplanned adventure that might spark the inspiration he desperately needed. Accompanied by his trusted chauffeur, James, Robert felt a flicker of excitement. James had been with Robert for over a decade, witnessing his rise to staggering wealth and, more importantly, his fall into profound loneliness. The road stretched ahead, promising unknown destinations and, perhaps, unexpected revelations. Robert settled into the back seat, the hum of the engine a comforting backdrop to his thoughts. He glanced out the window, the cityscape giving way to open fields, his mind wandering to possibilities and what-ifs. As miles rolled by, Robert couldn't shake the sense that this journey was more than just a business expedition. He hoped to find a project that would reignite his passion, yet he also longed for something to fill the emptiness that money couldn't touch. James, ever perceptive, sensed the gravity of this trip. He kept the conversation light, steering clear of the deeper topics he knew troubled Robert, waiting for the right moment to lend an ear. The car glided through small towns and scenic landscapes, each turn of the wheel leading them farther from the familiar and deeper into the unknown. Robert's eyes lingered on the passing scenes, wondering if this was where he might find the next big idea or even a new beginning. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of dread and hope intertwining in his chest as they ventured further from his opulent yet empty mansion. At a quaint roadside diner, they stopped for lunch. Robert observed the patrons, their simple lives a stark contrast to his own complicated existence. He envied their apparent contentment. As he picked at his food, he wondered if he'd ever find such peace. James noticed his employer's faraway look, recognizing it as a sign that Robert's thoughts were drifting to darker places. He knew better than to interrupt, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. The journey continued, and Robert's mind wandered to the reason behind his restlessness. It wasn't just about a new business venture. It was about connection. The loss of his son, Michael, 5 years ago had left a scar that no amount of wealth could heal. This trip, he hoped, might be a step toward mending his broken heart. James, aware of the shadow that Michael's absence cast, remained quietly supportive, ready to assist however he could. They drove on, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to dense forests. The scenery outside mirrored the internal journey Robert was on, navigating through memories and emotions he usually kept locked away. Each passing mile seemed to peel back another layer of his guarded heart, exposing raw wounds that had never truly healed. James, sensing the shift, adjusted their route, choosing quieter roads where they could talk if Robert decided to open up. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Robert finally spoke of his son. His voice was soft, tinged with sorrow and longing. He loved sunsets, Robert said, breaking the silence. James nodded, his eyes on the road but his attention fully on Robert. It was a small admission, but it was a start. Robert felt a slight release, like the first breath after being underwater too long. With nightfall, they found a modest inn to rest. The room was a far cry from Robert's usual luxury, but it was exactly what he needed, something simple and grounding. He lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, thoughts of Michael swirling in his mind. He clung to the hope that this journey would bring clarity, or, at the very least, a sense of direction. The silence of the night was both a comfort and a challenge, forcing him to face the emotions he often buried. The next morning, they set off again. Robert felt a subtle shift within him, a sense that he was moving towards something significant, even if he didn't know what it was yet. He glanced at James, who offered a reassuring smile. This journey, unpredictable as it was, held the promise of discovery, and Robert was starting to believe that it might be exactly what he needed. As they continued down the winding roads, he felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. The scenery outside the window became a blur as Robert's mind raced with thoughts of Michael. The journey was no longer just about a business venture. It was becoming a quest for healing. He wondered if, by some miracle, this road trip could lead him to answers about his son. James, sensing the deepening complexity of Robert's thoughts, drove with steady determination, ready to support his employer in whatever way he needed. Robert began to talk more about Michael as they traveled. He recounted stories from his childhood, moments of joy and pride that now felt bittersweet. James listened intently, offering words of comfort and understanding. This shared remembrance brought them closer, creating a bond forged in shared grief and the pursuit of closure. Robert felt a growing sense of purpose, a belief that this journey might indeed lead to something transformative. As the miles stretched on, Robert found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He spoke of his regrets, the missed opportunities, and the pain of Michael's disappearance. James offered silent support, his presence a steady anchor in the emotional storm. Robert realized that this journey was as much about finding himself as it was about finding a new project. He was beginning to understand that healing was a process, and this road trip was a crucial step. Every town they passed through, every conversation they had, brought Robert a little closer to confronting his deepest fears and hopes. He started to see this journey as more than just a distraction from his pain. It was a path towards understanding and perhaps redemption. With James by his side, Robert felt a cautious optimism. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever it might bring. Robert's life had changed forever 5 years ago when his son, Michael, disappeared without a trace. The young man had been the center of Robert's universe, the light in his often lonely world. That fateful day, Michael had simply vanished, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions and a father consumed by grief. Despite exhaustive searches and endless inquiries, Michael remained lost to the world, and Robert's heart ached with the void left in his absence. Each day since had been a battle against the overwhelming pain and the haunting memories. Robert's once vibrant eyes now held a permanent shadow of sorrow, a reflection of the nights spent sleeplessly wondering where Michael was. His mansion, filled with luxuries, felt more like a mausoleum, each room echoing with memories of laughter that had long since faded. The vibrant life he had once envisioned for his son had turned into a series of what-ifs and shattered dreams. Robert often found himself staring at old photographs, tracing Michael's features with a trembling finger, as if hoping to summon him back. His favorite picture was one of Michael at his high school graduation, beaming with pride and excitement for the future. It was a future that never came to be. The pain of that loss was a constant, gnawing presence, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. It had changed Robert in ways he never thought possible. Michael's disappearance had also strained Robert's relationships with those around him. Friends and acquaintances, unsure of how to approach his grief, had slowly drifted away. Business associates treaded carefully, their interactions becoming increasingly superficial. The loneliness that followed was suffocating. Only James remained steadfast, a silent pillar of support, understanding the depths of Robert's sorrow without the need for words. James had been there through it all, witnessing the descent into despair. Despite his immense wealth, Robert felt powerless in the face of his son's disappearance. He had hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and even turned to the media, but every lead ended in heartbreak. The endless cycle of hope and disappointment took its toll, leaving him more isolated and withdrawn. He buried himself in work, trying to distract from the crushing reality, but nothing could fill the gaping hole in his heart. The weight of guilt also plagued Robert. He questioned every decision, every action, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent Michael's disappearance. The what-ifs tormented him, feeding the relentless guilt that gnawed at his soul. He wondered if he had been too focused on his business, if he had missed signs that Michael was in trouble. These thoughts were a relentless echo in his mind, driving him to the brink of despair. His relationship with Michael had been his greatest joy and now his deepest sorrow. Robert remembered the late-night talks, the shared dreams, and the promises of a future they would build together. The bond they shared was irreplaceable, making the pain of his absence even more profound. Each memory was a double-edged sword, a reminder of the love that had been and the loss that now defined his existence. The silence left by Michael's absence was deafening. Even the smallest things could trigger a wave of grief. A familiar song on the radio, a scent that reminded him of Michael, or seeing a young man who resembled his son. It all brought the pain rushing back. Robert had tried to move forward, to live his life as Michael would have wanted. But the wound was too deep, the loss too great. It was as if time had frozen on that day 5 years ago, and he was trapped in an endless cycle of mourning. James often found Robert lost in these memories, his eyes glazed over as he relived moments with his son. He never intruded, understanding that these were sacred spaces where Robert sought solace. Instead, he offered quiet companionship, a steady presence that grounded Robert when the waves of grief threatened to pull him under. James knew that no words could heal the wound, but his loyalty and understanding provided a lifeline for Robert in his darkest moments. Robert's grief also brought an acute awareness of time and its fleeting nature. He realized that all the wealth in the world couldn't buy back the moments he had lost with Michael. This understanding deepened his sorrow, but it also fueled his determination to find some semblance of closure. He clung to the hope, however slim, that he might still find answers, that he might still see his son again. This hope was a fragile thread, but it was all he had. As the years passed, Robert's quest for answers became a personal crusade. He scoured every corner of the globe, followed every lead, no matter how improbable. The search gave him purpose, a reason to wake up each morning, even if the hope of finding Michael was dwindling. This relentless pursuit of his son was driven by love and the unyielding belief that a father should never give up on his child. It was this belief that kept Robert going, even on the darkest days. The memory of Michael's disappearance cast a long shadow over every aspect of Robert's life. His business decisions, his interactions with others, and even his own sense of self were all colored by this loss. The world saw a successful man, but behind the facade was a broken father, yearning for his son. This duality was a constant struggle, a reminder that no amount of success could ever heal the wounds of the heart. Yet, Robert held on to the belief that one day he might find peace. This road trip, conceived as a means to distract and perhaps find a new business venture, had inadvertently become a journey through his own grief. As the miles stretched on, Robert began to confront the depths of his sorrow, the memories he had buried, and the hope he still clung to. With James by his side, he felt a glimmer of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this journey would bring him closer to the answers he so desperately sought. As the journey progressed, Robert found himself increasingly reflective, the passing landscapes triggering memories of times spent with Michael. It was during one of these quiet moments, while driving through a small, bustling town, that something caught Robert's eye. Amid the sea of people, he noticed a young man with a familiar gait, wearing a leather jacket that seemed oddly out of place. But it wasn't the jacket that held Robert's attention. It was the watch on the young man's wrist. Robert's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the distinctive watch. It was a unique timepiece, one he had gifted to Michael on his 18th birthday. The intricate design and custom engraving made it unmistakable. A surge of hope and confusion washed over him. Could it be possible that this stranger had some connection to his son? The watch was one of a kind. Seeing it here, on a stranger, felt like a sign, a beacon in his long, dark journey of grief. He could hardly believe his eyes. The watch was unmistakable, a rare, custom-made piece with Michael's initials engraved on the back. Robert's mind raced with questions. How did this young man come to possess Michael's watch? Was this a mere coincidence, or was it a clue leading to his son? The air in the car seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of this unexpected discovery. Robert felt a mix of emotions, hope, fear, and a burgeoning sense of determination. James noticed Robert's sudden change in demeanor. Following his gaze, he too spotted the young man and the watch. Without a word, James understood the significance. He pulled the car to a discreet stop, his own pulse quickening with the possibilities this sighting suggested. The bustling town seemed to fade into the background as the two men focused on the young man. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he fought to regain his composure, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The young man was walking casually, unaware of the intense scrutiny he was under. Robert's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to approach this delicately. Any rash actions could scare the young man away. With a deep breath, Robert gestured to James, who nodded in silent agreement. They would follow him, observe, and find the right moment to approach. This could be the breakthrough Robert had been longing for, and he couldn't afford to let it slip away. As they trailed the young man through the busy streets, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that this was no mere coincidence. Every step he took felt like it was guided by something larger, something beyond his control. The watch, a symbol of his deep bond with Michael, had found its way back into his life. It was as if fate was intervening, giving him a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. James maneuvered the car with practiced ease, keeping a careful distance to avoid arousing suspicion. Robert's eyes never left the young man, every detail of his appearance and movements etched into his memory. The watch gleamed in the sunlight, a silent testament to the connection they sought. Robert's mind raced with possibilities. Could this young man have information about Michael? Was he a friend, an enemy, or merely a passerby who had stumbled upon the watch? The town's narrow streets and busy squares offered plenty of opportunities to lose sight of their target, but James's skilled driving and Robert's unwavering focus kept them on track. The young man eventually stopped at a small cafe, taking a seat by the window. Robert saw this as an opportunity. He and James parked nearby, positioning themselves where they could observe without being too conspicuous. The tension in the car was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. As they watched, Robert felt a surge of memories flood his mind. He recalled the day he had given Michael the watch, the pride and joy in his son's eyes. It had been a symbol of their bond, a promise of a bright future. Now, seeing it on the wrist of a stranger, those memories took on a bittersweet edge. Robert clung to the hope that this young man could lead him to Michael, or at least provide some answers to the questions that had haunted him for years. James suggested they wait for the young man to leave the cafe before making their move. Robert agreed, knowing that patience was crucial. They needed to approach this carefully, to avoid scaring him off or drawing unnecessary attention. The minutes felt like hours as they waited, their eyes never straying from the young man. Each second seemed to stretch, filled with the weight of unspoken fears and unfulfilled hopes. Robert's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Finally, the young man stood up, leaving the cafe and heading towards a quieter part of town. Robert and James followed, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The streets grew less crowded, providing a better opportunity to approach. Robert could hardly contain his emotions. Hope, fear, and a desperate longing for answers warred within him. As they closed the distance, Robert knew this was the moment of truth. He had to find out how this young man came to possess Michael's watch. They finally reached a quiet park, where the young man sat on a bench, seemingly lost in thought. This was their chance. Robert took a deep breath, his heart racing, and approached him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The young man looked up, surprised. Robert pointed to the watch. "That watch, it belonged to my son. How did you come by it?" The young man's eyes widened, and for a moment, Robert saw a flicker of recognition. The young man hesitated, glancing at the watch on his wrist. Robert held his breath, waiting for the answer that could change everything. Finally, the young man spoke. "I got it from someone a while back," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I didn't know it belonged to someone else." Robert's heart ached with the possibility that this might be a dead end, but he pressed on, desperate for any scrap of information that might lead him to Michael. The conversation that followed was filled with tentative questions and cautious answers. Robert learned that the young man's name was Daniel, and that he had come across the watch under unusual circumstances. Every detail Daniel provided felt like a piece of a complex puzzle. Robert clung to every word, hoping to find a thread that would lead him to his son. James stood by, his presence a steady reassurance as Robert delved deeper into the mystery surrounding the watch. When Robert saw the watch, time seemed to freeze. His body went rigid, eyes locked onto the familiar glint of metal on the young man's wrist. The bustling town around him faded into the background, replaced by a rush of memories and emotions that overwhelmed him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move. The world spun as he grappled with the significance of what he was seeing. The watch was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of his deep bond with Michael. Seeing it again after all these years brought a tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. Hope surged within him, a fragile, flickering flame amidst the darkness of his grief. Yet, fear quickly followed, a fear that this might lead to more heartbreak. Confusion clouded his mind as he tried to process how this stranger had come to possess something so precious. James noticed Robert's sudden stillness and followed his gaze to the young man. He saw the watch and immediately understood its significance. Without saying a word, he placed a steadying hand on Robert's shoulder, grounding him in the present. Robert's emotions were a chaotic storm, but James's calm presence provided a much-needed anchor. The moment felt surreal, a blend of past and present colliding in a way Robert had never anticipated. As the initial shock wore off, Robert felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. He needed answers, needed to know how this young man had come into possession of Michael's watch. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he steeled himself for whatever he might learn. Taking a deep breath, he nodded to James, signaling that they should follow the young man and find the right moment to approach him. Every step felt heavy with the weight of anticipation. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the hope and fear that battled within him. The watch had been a gift of love, a connection to his son that he had thought lost forever. Now, seeing it again, he felt a glimmer of possibility, a chance to uncover the truth. The emotions were almost too much to bear, but he pushed forward, driven by the need for closure. As they followed the young man, Robert's mind raced with questions. Who was this young man? How had he come by Michael's watch? Each question led to another, creating a labyrinth of possibilities. The hope that had sparked within him was fragile, easily shattered by the reality that he might be grasping at straws. But Robert couldn't afford to let doubt take over. He had to see this through, no matter where it led. The young man stopped at a cafe, giving Robert and James a chance to pause and collect themselves. Robert's emotions were still a tumultuous mix of hope, fear, and confusion. He watched the young man closely, searching for any clue that might reveal his connection to Michael. The anticipation was almost unbearable, each passing second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Robert knew he had to approach this carefully, balancing his need for answers with the risk of scaring the young man away. When the young man finally left the cafe, Robert felt his heart leap into his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. He and James followed at a respectful distance, the tension between them palpable. Robert's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, each step bringing him closer to the answers he so desperately sought. The watch was a beacon, guiding him through the fog of uncertainty. Approaching the young man in the park, Robert's hands trembled slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but tinged with the weight of his emotions. "Excuse me," he began. His eyes locked onto the watch. The young man looked up, surprised and curious. Robert took a deep breath, pointing to the watch. "That watch, it belonged to my son. How did you come by it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with significance. The young man's response was hesitant, his eyes widening as he glanced at the watch. Robert felt a mixture of hope and dread, waiting for the answer that could change everything. "I got it from someone a while back," the young man explained, his voice uncertain. "I didn't know it belonged to someone else." The words were a double-edged sword, offering both a possible lead and the risk of disappointment. Robert's heart ached with the tension of the moment. As the conversation unfolded, Robert found himself oscillating between hope and fear. The young man, Daniel, seemed genuine, his confusion mirroring Robert's own. Every detail Daniel provided was a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle that Robert had been trying to solve for years. The intensity of his emotions was almost overwhelming, but he clung to the possibility that this might finally lead him to Michael. The park, once a serene backdrop, now felt charged with emotion. Robert's mind raced as he absorbed Daniel's story. Each word was scrutinized, each detail weighed. The watch had resurfaced in the most unexpected way, bringing with it a flood of emotions and the hope of answers. Robert's determination grew with each passing moment. He had to follow this lead, wherever it might take him. James, standing by, offered silent support. He knew how much this moment meant to Robert, how the discovery of the watch had reignited a spark of hope. James's presence was a steadying force, a reminder that Robert wasn't alone in his search. The journey ahead was uncertain, but together, they could face whatever came next. Robert drew strength from this, ready to pursue the truth with renewed vigor. Determined to uncover the truth, Robert and James decided to follow Daniel. The urgency of their mission was palpable. Every second felt precious. They watched as Daniel meandered through the park, then headed towards a bustling market. Robert's mind was a whirl of thoughts, each one fueled by the hope that this could lead him to Michael. The watch was a powerful symbol, a beacon that kept him focused on the task at hand. As they trailed Daniel through the crowded market, Robert's emotions swung between hope and fear. The market was alive with activity, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing, and the scent of fresh produce filling the air. But for Robert, everything was a blur, his focus entirely on Daniel. He had to find a way to approach him again, to dig deeper into the story of how he acquired Michael's watch. James, ever the steady presence, kept close to Robert, offering silent support. He knew how much this meant to his employer, the chance to find answers after years of uncertainty. They navigated through the throng of people, careful not to lose sight of Daniel. The market's chaotic energy contrasted sharply with the intense focus of their mission. Every step brought them closer to the possibility of finding Michael, and Robert clung to that hope with all his might. Daniel finally stopped at a small, run-down building at the edge of the market. He glanced around nervously before entering, a behavior that piqued Robert's interest even more. What was Daniel hiding? Robert's heart raced as he and James approached the building, careful to stay out of sight. They needed to figure out the best way to proceed, to find out what Daniel knew without scaring him off. The stakes were too high to risk any mistakes. They waited for a few minutes, gathering their thoughts and planning their next move. Robert's mind was a storm of emotions, anticipation, fear, and a desperate need for answers. He looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they entered the building, hoping that this would bring them closer to Michael. The dimly lit interior smelled of dampness and decay, adding to the tension. Robert's senses were on high alert, every sound magnified in the stillness. Inside, they found a narrow hallway leading to several rooms. Voices echoed from one of them, and Robert recognized Daniel's voice. He strained to listen, trying to catch any useful information. The conversation was muffled, but certain words stood out. Mentions of a watch, a name he couldn't quite make out. The fragments of conversation only fueled his determination. He motioned for James to follow as they edged closer, careful to remain unnoticed. The door to the room was slightly ajar, allowing Robert and James to peek inside. Daniel was talking to an older man, gesturing animatedly with his hands. The older man seemed agitated, his expressions ranging from concern to anger. Robert watched intently, trying to piece together the context. It was clear that the watch was a significant topic of their discussion. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through him. Suddenly, the older man glanced towards the door, and Robert and James quickly moved back, hiding in the shadows. The tension was almost unbearable, every second feeling like an eternity. Robert's mind raced with possibilities. Who was this older man? How was he connected to Daniel and the watch? The answers seemed tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for whatever might come next. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, Daniel emerged from the room, looking troubled. Robert and James exchanged glances, knowing they had to act fast. They followed Daniel as he left the building and headed down a quiet alley. Robert's mind was a whirlwind, filled with the need for answers and the fear of what those answers might be. The alleyway was narrow and dimly lit, adding to the sense of urgency and tension. Finally, Robert called out to Daniel, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Daniel, wait." Daniel turned, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. Robert approached cautiously, James by his side. "We need to talk," Robert continued. "Please, I just want to know about the watch." Daniel hesitated, glancing around as if seeking an escape. But something in Robert's eyes must have convinced him of their sincerity, because he nodded reluctantly. They moved to a quieter spot, away from prying eyes. Daniel looked at the watch on his wrist, then back at Robert. "I didn't know it was so important," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I got it from a man a few years ago. He said he found it." Robert's heart skipped a beat. This was the first real lead he had in years. He pressed gently, asking for more details, hoping that Daniel could provide the crucial information that would lead him to Michael. As Daniel recounted his story, Robert listened intently, absorbing every detail. The man who had given Daniel the watch had mentioned finding it in a small town not far from where they were now. This revelation was like a key, unlocking new possibilities. Robert's mind raced with plans, trying to figure out their next move. James, sensing the importance of the moment, remained silent but vigilant, ready to support Robert in any way necessary. The desperation in Robert's eyes must have been clear, because Daniel seemed to soften. He agreed to take them to the place where the watch had been found, hoping it might provide more clues. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Robert felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was closer to finding answers than he had been in years. With Daniel's help, he might finally uncover the truth about Michael's disappearance. As they arrived at the small town where the watch was found, Daniel guided Robert and James to a modest house on the outskirts. The air was thick with anticipation. Robert's heart pounded as he wondered what they might discover inside. Daniel knocked on the door, and an elderly man answered, his eyes widening in recognition at the sight of the watch on Daniel's wrist. This was the man who had originally found it. The elderly man, named Harold, invited them in. His home was humble, filled with trinkets and memories of a long life. He seemed wary but willing to share his story. Over cups of tea, Harold recounted how he had come across the watch. It was found in an abandoned car at the edge of town, a car that had been there for years. Robert listened intently, each word fueling his hope that this might lead him to Michael. Harold's story was detailed. He described the car, its condition, and the belongings inside. Among them was the watch, which he had kept, hoping to someday return it to its owner. Robert's mind raced with the implications of this discovery. Could this abandoned car be connected to Michael's disappearance? He pressed Harold for more information, asking about the car and any other items that might have been inside. Harold's eyes softened with empathy as he realized the depth of Robert's search. He offered to take them to the car's location, a gesture that filled Robert with gratitude. Together, they walked to the edge of town, where the car sat, rusted and forgotten. Seeing it brought a wave of emotions crashing over Robert. The car was a tangible link to the past, a clue that could lead him to his son. He approached it with a mixture of hope and dread. The car was in a state of disrepair, covered in dirt and overgrown with weeds. As Robert examined it, he felt a strange sense of connection, as if Michael's presence lingered in the air. He searched the car thoroughly, looking for anything that might provide a clue. Inside, he found old, weathered papers and personal items that seemed insignificant but held the potential for deeper meaning. Each discovery, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to finding Michael. As Robert continued his search, Daniel and James watched silently, their presence a steady support. Harold stood nearby, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Robert's determination was palpable, a force that drove him to keep looking despite the emotional toll. Finally, in the glove compartment, he found something, a faded photograph of Michael. Tears welled up in Robert's eyes as he held the photo, a tangible piece of his son that had been lost to him for so long. The discovery of the photograph was a breakthrough. It confirmed that Michael had been in this town, possibly using the car as a hideout. Robert's mind buzzed with possibilities. He turned to Harold, asking if he remembered anything else about the car or its previous owner. Harold shook his head, but mentioned that there had been rumors about a young man who had stayed in town briefly before vanishing without a trace. These rumors reignited Robert's hope. He knew he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how tenuous. With Harold's help, they began asking around town, talking to locals who might remember something about Michael. The responses were varied, but a few people did recall a young man matching Michael's description. He had been seen at the local diner, working odd jobs to get by. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle coming together. At the diner, they spoke with the owner, a kind woman named Linda who remembered Michael vividly. She described him as a polite but troubled young man who kept to himself. Robert listened with a heavy heart, imagining the hardships his son must have endured. Linda mentioned that Michael had talked about leaving town to start fresh somewhere else. This revelation both relieved and worried Robert. Michael was alive when he left, but where had he gone? Determined to track down every clue, Robert thanked Linda and continued his search. He, James, and Daniel followed every lead, no matter how small. The search took them to different parts of town, talking to various people who might have crossed paths with Michael. Each conversation brought new insights, painting a picture of Michael's life during those lost years. The journey was exhausting, but Robert's determination never wavered. As the day drew to a close, Robert felt both hopeful and frustrated. He had gathered valuable information, but still lacked a clear path to Michael. James suggested they regroup and plan their next steps carefully. Robert agreed, knowing they couldn't rush this delicate process. They returned to Harold's home, where he offered them a place to rest and gather their thoughts. Robert felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue his search with fresh resolve. That evening, as they sat in Harold's cozy living room, Robert reviewed everything they had learned. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still gaps. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but with James and Daniel by his side, he felt stronger. The bond between them had deepened through this shared quest, turning strangers into allies. Together, they vowed to continue the search for Michael, determined to bring him home. With renewed determination, Robert, James, and Daniel set out early the next morning, piecing together the scattered clues from their conversations with the townspeople. They followed every lead, no matter how small, and it led them to a network of people who had seen Michael in his journey. Each interaction, each story, brought Robert closer to understanding what had happened to his son and where he might be now. Their search took them to a remote cabin in the woods, a place where Michael had reportedly stayed for a while. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by dense trees and the sounds of nature. As they approached, Robert felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear. What if this was another dead end? What if the truth was more painful than he could bear? But he had come too far to turn back now. He had to see this through. Inside the cabin, they found remnants of someone's life. A worn-out bed, scattered papers, and personal belongings that spoke of a transient existence. Among the items, Robert discovered a journal, its pages filled with Michael's handwriting. Tears welled up in his eyes as he carefully read each entry. The journal detailed Michael's struggles, his attempts to find peace, and his hope for a new beginning. It was a window into his son's soul, a poignant reminder of the life he had been living. Michael's words painted a picture of a young man grappling with his identity and his past. The entries were filled with both pain and hope, revealing the depth of his struggles and his determination to move forward. Robert's heart ached as he read about the challenges Michael had faced, alone and far from home. The journal was a testament to Michael's resilience, a quality that Robert admired and found solace in. One entry stood out, a reference to a small town a few hundred miles away, where Michael had planned to settle. This was the most concrete lead they had found. Robert felt a surge of hope, mingled with apprehension. He shared the discovery with James and Daniel, who both agreed that this was their next destination. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, Robert felt a glimmer of hope that he was on the right path. The drive to the new town was filled with a tense silence. Each of them was lost in their thoughts, contemplating the significance of the journal and the clues it held. Robert clung to the hope that they were close to finding Michael, but he was also wary of getting his hopes up too high. The emotional toll of the journey weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had to remain strong, for Michael and for himself. As they arrived in the town, Robert was struck by its quaint charm. It was a place where Michael might have found solace, a place to rebuild his life. They began their search anew, talking to locals and showing them Michael's photograph. The responses were mixed, but a few people recognized him, confirming that he had indeed been there. Each confirmation was a step closer, each recognition a beacon of hope. One lead took them to a community center where Michael had volunteered. The director, a kind woman named Sarah, remembered him well. She described him as hardworking and compassionate, always willing to lend a hand. Robert felt a swell of pride and sorrow. Hearing about Michael's kindness and resilience gave him hope, but it also reminded him of how much he had missed. Sarah mentioned that Michael had left a few months ago, leaving behind a note of gratitude and hope. The note, which Sarah shared with Robert, was a heartfelt message of thanks to the community that had embraced him. Michael had written about his journey of healing and his plans to continue moving forward. The words were a bittersweet comfort to Robert, a reminder of his son's strength and his enduring spirit. It was clear that Michael had found some measure of peace here, even if only temporarily. Encouraged by the note, Robert pressed on, determined to follow Michael's trail. They visited shelters, cafes, and libraries, piecing together the fragments of his son's life. Each new discovery brought Robert closer to understanding Michael's journey and the challenges he had faced. The town became a map of Michael's resilience, each location a testament to his will to survive and thrive despite the odds. As the day wore on, they received a promising lead from a local librarian who had befriended Michael. She mentioned that he had talked about moving to a nearby city to pursue a job opportunity. This lead was crucial, offering a concrete direction for their search. Robert felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the pieces were starting to come together. With the librarian's help, they gathered more information about the city and the potential places where Michael might have gone. Robert's heart pounded with renewed hope. The journey had been long and arduous, but he was determined to see it through. He could almost feel Michael's presence, a guiding force that kept him moving forward. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainties, but Robert was ready to face them, fueled by the love for his son. That evening, as they prepared to set out for the city, Robert took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The search for Michael had been a journey of both discovery and healing. He had uncovered truths about his son and himself, finding strength in the face of uncertainty. With James and Daniel by his side, he felt ready to continue the search, hopeful that they were on the brink of a long-awaited reunion. As they approached the city, Robert's anticipation grew. The clues had led them here, and he felt closer to Michael than ever before. They arrived at a modest apartment building, the address given to them by the librarian. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a mixture of hope and fear. He glanced at James and Daniel, their supportive presence a steadying force. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Robert approached the door with trembling hands. He took a deep breath and knocked. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, the door opened, revealing a young man whose face Robert had longed to see. It was Michael. For a moment, time stood still as father and son locked eyes, the years of pain and separation melting away in the intensity of the moment. Michael's expression was a mix of shock, relief, and overwhelming emotion. "Dad?" Michael's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide with disbelief. Robert stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Michael, it's really you," he choked out, his voice trembling with emotion. They embraced, the hug conveying all the words they couldn't say. The years of separation, the pain and longing, all dissolved in that moment of reunion. It was a moment neither of them would ever forget. James and Daniel stood back, giving them space to reconnect. The room was filled with a palpable sense of relief and joy. Michael pulled back, looking at his father with a mixture of guilt and happiness. "I'm sorry, Dad. I never meant to disappear like that," he said, his voice breaking. Robert shook his head, wiping away tears. "You're here now. That's all that matters," he replied, his voice filled with love and forgiveness. They sat down, and Michael began to recount his journey. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, the reasons he had left, and his struggle to find himself. Robert listened intently, absorbing every word. The pain of the past was still there, but so was a newfound understanding. Michael's story was one of resilience and survival, a testament to his strength. Robert felt a deep sense of pride and admiration for his son. Michael explained how he had ended up in the city, finding solace and purpose in a new life. He had struggled, but he had also found kindness and support from strangers. The watch, the symbol of their bond, had been his constant companion, a reminder of his father's love. Robert listened with tears in his eyes, each word a balm to his long-suffering heart. The journey had been hard, but it had brought them back together. As they talked, the weight of the years apart began to lift. Michael's presence filled the void that had haunted Robert for so long. They spoke for hours, sharing stories and reconnecting. Robert learned about the people who had helped Michael along the way, the jobs he had taken, and the dreams he still held. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, fitting together to form a picture of the son he had missed so deeply. James and Daniel joined them, the conversation turning lighter as they shared their own perspectives on the journey. The room was filled with laughter and tears, a celebration of the reunion they had all worked so hard to achieve. The bond between them had grown stronger through the shared experience. Robert felt a profound sense of gratitude for their support. Without them, he might never have found Michael. That evening, as they sat together in Michael's apartment, Robert felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had led to this moment of joy and reconciliation. He looked at his son, now a young man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. The future was still uncertain, but Robert felt ready to face it, knowing that they were together again. Michael shared his plans for the future, his hopes and dreams rekindled by the reunion. He spoke of wanting to return to school, to build a life that honored the bond he had with his father. Robert listened with pride, offering his unwavering support. The pain of the past had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a source of strength and inspiration. Together, they could face whatever lay ahead. As the night drew to a close, Robert felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey to find Michael had also been a journey of self-discovery. He had confronted his deepest fears and found the strength to keep going. The reunion had healed old wounds and created a foundation for a new beginning. Robert knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them with his son by his side. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. After the heart-wrenching reunion between Robert and Michael, we're reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to overcome even the greatest of obstacles. If you enjoyed this story, you'll want to see our next one, filled with unexpected twists and heartfelt moments. Imagine the shock when, after her husband's funeral, a woman is thrown out of her apartment by her daughter-in-law, only to discover a hidden secret in the will that changes everything. This revelation will leave you on the edge of your seat, eager to find out what happens next. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to continue receiving these captivating stories. And if you'd like to support us, click the link in the pinned comment to buy me a coffee. Your contributions help us keep bringing you these daily emotional tales. Thank you for being a part of our storytelling community.